A gang of vicious bikers thought they had found an easy target when they surrounded a decorated 94-year-old veteran outside Westminster Palace. They mocked his medals, earned in battles they couldn't imagine, and threatened to tear them from his chest. But as they closed in around the elderly hero, they failed to notice the royal guard in the shadows, a highly trained warrior who was about to remind them that some lines should never be crossed. What happened next would become a legend among the palace guards, and a powerful reminder that true courage knows no age. The late autumn sun cast long shadows across the ancient stones of Westminster Palace, its golden rays catching on the polished brass buttons of the Royal Guard's uniforms. Among them stood Thomas Bradley, his 6'2" frame motionless as marble, dark eyes scanning the surge of tourists that ebbed and flowed before the palace gates. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 20 years of service had taught him to read crowds like others read books, noting every subtle shift in the human tide. His reputation among fellow guards was legendary. They called him the Sentinel, for his uncanny ability to spot trouble before it materialized. This crisp October morning felt different. Perhaps it was the way the wind carried a hint of approaching winter, or how the clouds cast shifting patterns across the courtyard's worn cobblestones. Whatever it was, it made Thomas's neck prickle with an instinct honed by years of standing watch. The tourists seemed ordinary enough, families posing for photos, schoolchildren on field trips, elderly couples consulting their guidebooks. But something in the air felt charged with anticipation. Through the sea of smartphones and selfie sticks, he noticed an elderly gentleman approaching the palace gates. The man's weathered face and straight-backed posture spoke of military bearing, despite his advanced years. A polished wooden cane supported his careful steps, and a chest full of medals gleamed against his well-maintained navy blazer. Even at a distance, Thomas recognized the distinguished arrangement of ribbons. This was no ceremonial veteran, but a true warrior who had earned every decoration through blood and sacrifice. The sunlight caught on a particular medal that Thomas knew well, the Distinguished Service Order, awarded only for exemplary gallantry during active operations against the enemy. The old soldier's name was Edward Harrison, though Thomas wouldn't learn this until later. At 94, Edward still made his weekly pilgrimage to Westminster Palace, a tradition he'd maintained for decades. It was his way of honoring fallen comrades and remembering the oath he'd taken so many years ago to serve crown and country. Local vendors and regular visitors had grown accustomed to his presence, often nodding respectfully as he passed. Some even knew fragments of his story, whispered tales of heroism during the darkest days of war. As Edward paused to rest near an ancient oak tree, its leaves turning crimson with the season's change, the rumble of motorcycles shattered the morning's reverent atmosphere. 5 riders in leather cuts pulled up to the curb, their choppers' engines growling like hungry beasts. Tourist heads turned, cameras momentarily redirected from the palace to capture these unexpected intruders into the historical scene. The contrast was jarring, these modern-day outlaws against the backdrop of centuries-old tradition. Thomas's fingers tightened imperceptibly on his ceremonial rifle. In 2 decades of guard duty, he'd developed a sixth sense for trouble, and these bikers set off every internal alarm. Their leather cuts bore no recognized club patches. Instead, they displayed crude symbols that marked them as members of a newer, more volatile group that had been making headlines for all the wrong reasons. Recent police bulletins had warned of their growing presence in the city, their tendency toward unprovoked violence. The leader, a hulking figure with a serpentine tattoo crawling up his neck, dismounted first. His eyes locked onto Edward's medals like a predator spotting prey. He nudged one of his companions, a wiry man with a scarred face, and jerked his head toward the elderly veteran. The other 3 bikers spread out in a practiced formation that made Thomas's combat-trained mind analyze angles of approach and potential threats. Their boots scraped against the ancient cobblestones, the sound somehow more menacing than their motorcycles' roar. Tourists began to edge away, sensing the shift in atmosphere. A young mother hurried her children toward the palace gift shop, clutching them close as she passed. An elderly couple shuffled nervously toward the safety of a tour group, casting anxious glances over their shoulders. But Edward remained where he was, either unaware of the danger or, more likely, Thomas suspected, unwilling to show fear to these bullies. His grip on his cane tightened slightly, the only visible sign that he recognized the threat approaching. Protocol dictated that royal guards maintain their posts unless there was a direct threat to the palace or the royal family. Thomas had spent years perfecting the art of standing perfectly still while tourists posed beside him, made faces, and tried to make him crack a smile. But as he watched the bikers begin to close in around Edward Harrison, he felt the weight of a different duty pressing against his chest, one that went beyond written rules and spoken orders. His mind raced through regulations and procedures, searching for justification to act, while his conscience screamed that sometimes rules must bend to protect what they were meant to preserve. The leader of the bikers was now close enough that Thomas could read the crude text on his cut. Satan's orphans. The man's boots scuffed deliberately across the ancient cobblestones as he positioned himself directly in Edward's path. What happened next would force Thomas Bradley to make a choice between upholding palace protocol and honoring the deeper oath he'd sworn, to protect and serve. As morning settled over Westminster Palace, Thomas Bradley's instincts had already begun whispering warnings. His 2 decades of service taught him to notice the subtle signs that most would miss: the unusual patterns in crowd movement, the slight shifts in atmosphere that preceded trouble. Today, those instincts were screaming. He'd watched the palace grounds since dawn, observing the usual ebb and flow of tourists, but something felt off. The regular vendors who set up their souvenir stands seemed tenser than usual. Their movements hurried as they arranged their wares. Several had been talking in hushed tones about a group of bikers who'd been spotted in the area over the past few days, harassing visitors and causing disturbances. Thomas's fellow guard, William Morrison, had mentioned similar concerns during their shift change. "The local police briefed us this morning," William had whispered, his lips barely moving as protocol demanded. "New gang in town calling themselves Satan's Orphans. They've been targeting tourist areas, looking for easy marks." The morning's guided tours proceeded as normal, but Thomas noticed the tour guides taking slightly different routes, steering their groups away from certain areas. One guide, Mary, who'd been leading palace tours for 15 years, caught Thomas's eye as she passed. Her subtle head shake told him she'd seen something concerning. Through the corner of his eye, Thomas observed a group of teenagers on their phones, pointing at something beyond the palace gates. Their excited whispers carried across the courtyard. "Those bikes look sick. But why are they just sitting there? They've been circling the block for an hour." The autumn wind carried fragments of conversation from the street, the distinctive rumble of motorcycle engines, the occasional rev that seemed more threat than necessity. Thomas maintained his statue-like pose, but his senses were on high alert, cataloging every detail. A local newspaper vendor, setting up his stand near the palace entrance, was speaking quietly with a police constable. "Same group that caused trouble at the war memorial last week," the vendor muttered. "Tore down wreaths, scattered the flowers. No respect, these ones." The constable nodded grimly. "We've had reports they're escalating. Started with simple vandalism, now they're getting bolder, targeting tourists, veterans, anyone they think won't fight back." The conversation drifted away as they moved past Thomas's post, but their words had already deepened his concern. Through the main gates, Thomas could see the glint of chrome and leather. Motorcycles parked just at the edge of his vision, their riders lounging against them with calculated casualness. They seemed to be watching, waiting for something. Or someone. The regular morning crowds had thinned slightly, creating unusual gaps in the normally packed viewing areas. Parents were keeping their children closer, tourist groups clustering more tightly together. The invisible current of tension was affecting everyone, even if most couldn't identify why. Thomas noticed one of the palace security cameras slowly pivot, tracking movement near the street. In his earpiece, he heard the control room chatter increase. "Multiple subjects of interest at the North Gate. Keep eyes on. Local police have been notified." A young couple approached Thomas, wanting the usual tourist photo with a royal guard. But instead of the typical excited chatter, the man whispered as he posed, "Those bikers out there. They've been following different tour groups all morning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Should we report it? Thomas maintained his rigid pose, unable to respond, but he logged the information. This wasn't random. The bikers were scouting, looking for targets, building up to something. His muscles tensed imperceptibly beneath his uniform. Through the gathering clouds, the sun caught on something that drew Thomas's attention: the polished metals on an approaching elderly man's blazer. The veteran walked with dignity despite his advanced age, each step measured and proud. Thomas recognized many of the medals from his military training. Campaigns spanning decades, decorations for valor that spoke of extraordinary courage. In that same moment, he noticed the bikers' posture change. They straightened, nudging each other, pointing toward the elderly veteran. Their body language shifted from casual lounging to predatory interest. Thomas had seen that change before, in combat zones, the subtle tells that preceded an attack. More tourists were noticing now. A woman hurriedly put away her camera, ushering her children toward the palace gift shop. An elderly couple changed direction, seeking the safety of a larger group. The atmosphere had shifted from mere unease to imminent threat. The veteran seemed unaware of the attention he'd attracted, or perhaps he was choosing to ignore it. He continued his steady pace toward the palace gates, his cane tapping softly against the cobblestones. Each tap seemed to echo in Thomas's mind like a countdown. 20 years of guard duty had taught Thomas to read the preludes to violence. Now, every instinct, every lesson learned through years of military service and palace guard duty told him that trouble wasn't just coming, it had arrived. The only question was, when protocol dictated he maintain his post, what would he do when the inevitable confrontation began? The bikers made their move with practiced coordination. Like wolves separating prey from the herd, they circled their motorcycles around to different positions near the palace gates. Their leader, the hulking man with the serpentine neck tattoo, dismounted first. His heavy boots struck the cobblestones with deliberate force as he moved toward Edward Harrison. Thomas Bradley remained motionless at his post, but his trained eye caught every detail. The leader's cut bore fresh patches, one showing a skull wrapped in barbed wire, another displaying crossed switchblades. Intelligence briefings had mentioned these symbols, markers of recent violence, worn as badges of honor among the gang. "Oi, old-timer," the leader's voice carried across the courtyard. "Those medals look pretty heavy. Why don't you let us help you with them?" His mock concern drew snickers from his companions, who had begun to form a loose semicircle around Edward. The elderly veteran stopped, standing his ground with quiet dignity. His grip tightened almost imperceptibly on his cane as he assessed the situation. Thomas recognized the look in Edward's eyes, the calm calculation of a man who'd faced danger before. "I carry them just fine, thank you," Edward replied, his voice steady and clear. "They're not nearly as heavy as the memories they represent." He moved to step around the bikers, but they shifted to block his path. The wiry man with the scarred face reached out, fingers hovering near one of the medals. "What's this one for, then?" "Looks valuable." His tone carried an unmistakable threat. "Distinguished Service Order," Edward answered, stepping back slightly. "Awarded for leading a rescue mission in '53. 17 men made it home because of that operation." Pride and warning mingled in his voice, a reminder that the elderly man before them had once commanded troops in combat. Thomas felt his jaw tighten. Palace protocol was explicit. Guards must maintain their posts unless there was a direct threat to royal property or persons. But as he watched the scene unfold, the weight of another duty pressed against his conscience. These medals weren't just decorations, they were symbols of sacrifice, courage, and service to the crown. The biker leader moved closer, his shadow falling across Edward's medals. 17 men, eh? Well, there's 5 of us here now, old man, and we're not really interested in war stories. He reached out and flicked one of the medals with a grimy finger, more interested in what these might fetch at the right shop. A small crowd had gathered at a safe distance, phones recording the confrontation. Thomas could hear gasps and muttered concerns. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking why no one was helping the old soldier. Several tourists glanced toward Thomas and the other guards, their expressions a mix of confusion and anticipation. In his earpiece, Thomas heard the palace security team's chatter intensify. Situation developing at North Gate. Local police en route. 5 minutes out. 5 minutes could be an eternity in a confrontation like this. Edward's voice cut through the tension, carrying the authority of someone used to commanding respect. Last warning, son. Step aside. Despite his age, his bearing remained military straight, chin lifted in defiance. The leader's face darkened. Or what, old man? You'll hit us with your cane? He grabbed Edward's blazer, knuckles whitening around the fabric. Maybe we should teach you about respect. The veteran didn't struggle, but neither did he show fear. I learned about respect in places you can't imagine, fighting enemies far worse than playground bullies. His eyes met the bikers with steady determination. The question is, what will you learn here today? Thomas felt the moment of decision approaching like an oncoming storm. His training screamed at him to maintain his post, but everything else, his military background, his sense of duty, his basic human decency, urged him to act. He thought of his own grandfather, another veteran who'd told him that the hardest choices in life are between what's right and what's easy. The biker leader's other hand moved toward Edward's medals, fingers curling into a fist. Only thing you'll be learning is... A sharp voice cut through the courtyard. Stop right there! All heads turned toward Claire Bennett, a senior tour guide who'd stepped forward from the crowd. Security's already been called. You want to do this in front of all these cameras? The bikers hesitated, glancing around at the forest of phones recording them. Their leader's grip on Edward's blazer remained firm, but uncertainty flickered across his face. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Retreat now, or escalate to violence. Thomas Bradley had spent 20 years honoring protocol, standing guard through rain and shine, maintaining the stoic dignity expected of a royal guard. But as he watched the biker's knuckles whiten around Edward's blazer, he realized that sometimes the greatest honor comes not from following rules, but from following one's conscience. In that crucial moment, as the biker's grip tightened on Edward's blazer, Thomas Bradley made his decision. 20 years of unwavering protocol dissolved in the face of a higher duty. With deliberate precision, he stepped away from his post, his polished boots striking the cobblestones with purpose. The sound of a royal guard moving from his station sent ripples through the crowd. Tourists gasped, cameras swiveled, and a hushed anticipation fell over the courtyard. Even the palace pigeons seemed to pause their eternal scavenging, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Stand down. Thomas's voice carried the weight of command, cutting through the tension like a blade. The ceremonial rifle in his hands, though never loaded, suddenly seemed more imposing as he approached with measured steps. The biker leader's head snapped around, genuine surprise flickering across his face. Clearly, he'd assumed the guards were merely decorative living statues for tourists to photograph. Well, well, he sneered, though uncertainty crept into his voice. Looks like toy soldier wants to play. Thomas continued his advance, each step precise and calculated. His dark eyes, trained by years of combat experience, assessed distances and angles, noting the positions of all 5 bikers. In his earpiece, he could hear the control room erupting with activity. Bradley breaking formation. Alert senior command. Local police 3 minutes out. Last chance, Thomas announced, his voice carrying across the now silent courtyard. Release him and leave the grounds. His fellow guard, William Morrison, remained at his post but had shifted his stance slightly, ready to provide support if needed. The wiry biker with the scarred face moved to flank Thomas, but froze when William's voice rang out. That would be unwise. The warning was clear. This situation could escalate far beyond what the bikers had planned. Edward Harrison stood calmly in the gang leader's grip, his military bearing unchanged. His eyes met Thomas's with quiet appreciation, one soldier recognizing another. The medals on his chest caught the autumn sunlight, each one representing moments of valor that this new generation of troublemakers couldn't comprehend. "You're making a mistake, mate," the leader growled, though his grip on Edward's blazer had loosened slightly. "5 of us, 1 of you. Bad odds." His confidence seemed more bravado than conviction now, especially as he noted Thomas's impressive height and clearly muscled frame beneath the ceremonial uniform. "I've had worse," Thomas replied evenly. His mind flashed to his military service before joining the Royal Guard. Situations where the odds seemed impossible until training and determination proved otherwise. "But you should worry more about the odds against you. Assaulting a veteran on palace grounds with dozens of witnesses recording every moment?" The crowd had indeed grown larger, phones raised like a forest of electronic eyes. Several police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. The gang leader's companions shifted uneasily, their earlier bravado evaporating as reality set in. Claire Bennett, the tour guide who'd spoken up earlier, had quietly organized her group to block the bikers' easiest escape route. Other palace staff had positioned themselves strategically around the courtyard. What had started as an attempt to intimidate an elderly veteran had transformed into a situation the gang couldn't control. Thomas took another step forward, his ceremonial uniform gleaming in the sunlight. The brass buttons and polished leather, meant for show, now seemed to amplify his authority. "Your choice," he said, voice low but carrying clearly. "Walk away now, or face the consequences when backup arrives." The biker leader's face contorted with rage and embarrassment. His fingers flexed on Edward's blazer, pride warring with common sense. One of his companions muttered urgently, "Boss, this ain't worth it." Look around. Indeed, the scene had transformed. What began as a simple act of intimidation had become a tableau that would soon appear in newspapers and social media worldwide. "Royal Guard breaks formation to defend elderly veteran." The headlines would write themselves. Edward chose that moment to speak, his voice steady despite the tension. "Young man, I earned these medals fighting real enemies, men who believed strength meant hurting those they saw as weak." His eyes locked onto his captors. "I learned they were wrong then. You can learn that lesson now or learn it the hard way." The wail of police sirens grew louder, now just streets away. Thomas maintained his stance, ready to act if the situation escalated. But he could see the fight draining from the gang leader's eyes, replaced by the dawning realization that he'd severely miscalculated. With a final curse, the leader shoved Edward away from him. Thomas moved instantly, stepping between the veteran and his attacker, his presence a solid wall of authority. The other bikers were already backing toward their motorcycles, eager to escape before police arrived. "This isn't over," the leader spat, but his words rang hollow as he retreated. Thomas's only response was a steady gaze that promised he'd be ready if they ever returned. As the bikers' motorcycles roared away from Westminster Palace, the gravity of Thomas Bradley's actions began to settle over the courtyard. The gathered crowd erupted in spontaneous applause, their phones still recording every moment of the unprecedented scene. But Thomas's attention remained focused on Edward Harrison, who was straightening his blazer with dignified composure. "Are you all right, sir?" Thomas asked, maintaining his professional bearing despite having broken protocol. His ceremonial rifle remained at the ready, years of training evident in his precise stance. Edward nodded, adjusting his medals with careful fingers. "Thanks to you, son." His eyes, sharp despite his advanced age, studied Thomas's uniform. "Royal Fusiliers, weren't you? Before the guard?" Thomas couldn't hide his surprise. "Yes, sir. How did you know?" "The way you move," Edward replied with a knowing smile. "Some things don't change, no matter the uniform." He paused, his expression growing serious. "Though I suspect your current uniform might cause you some trouble after this." Before Thomas could respond, the courtyard filled with the efficient movement of arriving police officers. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins, a veteran of the Westminster beat, approached them with quick, purposeful strides. Her sharp eyes took in the scene, noting the gathered crowd, the palace staff maintaining order, and the unusual sight of a royal guard away from his post. "Mr. Harrison," she addressed Edward first, having dealt with him before during his regular visits. "Would you be willing to provide a statement?" Her notebook was already in hand, pen poised. "Certainly," Edward replied, his military bearing unmistakable, as he recounted the events with precise detail. Thomas listened, noting how the elderly veteran's account was clear and methodical, highlighting the biker's aggressive intentions without embellishment. Meanwhile, Palace security staff were reviewing footage from multiple angles. The uniformed police officers gathered statements from tourists and staff, their notepads filling with accounts of how the bikers had targeted Edward and how Thomas had intervened. Claire Bennett, the tour guide who had spoken up earlier, provided her own detailed account. "They were waiting for someone vulnerable," she explained to a young constable. "I've seen them around the area this past week, watching the crowds. When they spotted Mr. Harrison's medals..." She shook her head, disgust evident in her expression. Thomas maintained his professional composure, but internally, his mind raced. Breaking formation was a serious breach of protocol. In 2 decades of service, he'd never stepped away from his post without direct orders. The consequences could be severe. His fellow guard, William Morrison, had been relieved by another guard, and now approached the group. "Captain Blackwood wants to see you immediately," he murmured to Thomas. "But for what it's worth, you did the right thing." Detective Inspector Collins turned her attention to Thomas. "Guard Bradley, I'll need your statement as well. However," she glanced at the palace's imposing facade, "I understand you have internal procedures to follow first." The crowd was still lingering, phones raised, capturing every interaction. Social media would be buzzing within minutes. Thomas could already imagine the headlines: "Royal Guard breaks protocol to defend war hero." The palace's public relations team would have their hands full. Edward's voice cut through Thomas's thoughts. "I'd like to speak with your superiors," he announced, his tone carrying the authority of someone used to commanding respect. "Your guard here acted to protect both a citizen and the honor of military decorations awarded by the Crown. If anyone questions his actions, they'll have to question mine as well." Several onlookers nodded in approval. A young boy, perhaps 12, broke away from his parents to approach Edward. "Sir," he said hesitantly, "my grandfather has medals like yours. He says they tell stories of bravery." He glanced at Thomas. "I think you both have stories now." Edward's face softened as he regarded the boy. "Indeed we do, lad. Indeed we do." He turned back to Thomas. "Shall we face the music together, Guard Bradley?" "I may be retired, but I still remember how to navigate a chain of command." Thomas felt a surge of gratitude, though his expression remained professionally neutral. "Thank you, sir. But first..." He turned to Detective Collins. "Those men may return. They've shown a pattern of targeting veterans and tourists. I suggest increased patrols around the palace grounds and nearby monuments." Collins nodded, already typing on her phone. "We're implementing that now. Their descriptions match a group we've been tracking. This incident might give us what we need to move on them." She paused, looking between Thomas and Edward. "Your actions today may have prevented more than just this attack." As if to underscore the point, more tourists approached Edward, some offering support, others sharing stories of their own veteran relatives. The scene had transformed from one of tension and threat to something altogether different, a moment of community and respect spanning generations. Thomas knew that consequences awaited him inside the palace walls. Protocol existed for a reason, and he had chosen to break it. But watching Edward speak with the gathered people, his medals gleaming in the autumn sun, Thomas felt a deeper certainty. Some rules, when weighed against honor and duty, must bend to serve their true purpose. Inside Westminster Palace's administrative wing, Captain Victoria Blackwood's office radiated austere authority. Dark wood paneling and centuries-old portraits of former Guard commanders created an atmosphere of tradition and gravity. Thomas Bradley stood at attention before her desk, his posture perfect despite the tension evident in his jaw. 20 years of exemplary service, Captain Blackwood began, her voice carefully neutral as she reviewed the file on her desk. Not a single disciplinary mark, until today. She looked up, her steel gray eyes meeting Thomas's. "Explain yourself, Guard Bradley." Through the tall windows, Thomas could still see the courtyard where tourists clustered, many discussing what they'd witnessed. Edward Harrison had been escorted to another room to provide his official statement, but his words echoed in Thomas's mind. Some duties transcend protocol. "Ma'am," Thomas began, his voice steady. "I observed a direct threat to a decorated veteran on palace grounds. The assailants demonstrated clear intent to commit assault and theft of military honors awarded by the Crown." Captain Blackwood leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled. "Protocol dictates that guards maintain their posts unless there's a direct threat to palace security or the royal family. You know this better than most, Bradley. You've trained new guards on these very regulations." "Yes, ma'am." Thomas paused, choosing his next words carefully. "In my judgment, allowing criminals to assault a veteran and steal military decorations within sight of the palace would constitute a different kind of security threat, one to the dignity and honor of what we represent." A knock at the door interrupted them. Lieutenant James Foster, head of palace security, entered with a tablet in hand. "Ma'am, you need to see this." He placed the tablet before Captain Blackwood, who studied the screen with increasing intensity. "Social media?" she asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Exploding, ma'am," Foster confirmed. "The incident has gone viral. Multiple angles, dozens of witness accounts. Public reaction is," he glanced at Thomas, "overwhelmingly positive. The palace's public relations team is being flooded with messages of support." Captain Blackwood scrolled through the footage, her expression unreadable. "Our Royal Guard hero is trending," Foster continued, "and Mr. Harrison's military record has been identified by veterans groups online. His service record is remarkable." Thomas remained at attention, but his mind raced. He hadn't considered how quickly news would spread in today's connected world. Every tourist with a phone had become a documentary filmmaker, capturing his choice and its consequences for the world to see. "There's more," Foster added, pulling up another screen. "Local police have confirmed the bikers' identities. They're part of a gang that's been targeting veterans at war memorials across the city. They've stolen medals, vandalized monuments. This incident might help crack the case." Captain Blackwood set the tablet down with deliberate care. "Guard Bradley, you understand the position you've put us in? The Royal Guard's reputation is built on discipline, on adherence to protocol. If every guard decided to intervene in civilian matters—" "Permission to speak freely, ma'am," Thomas requested. At her nod, he continued. "The Royal Guard's reputation is built on honor. We stand as symbols of protection, of service to crown and country. Today, I chose to make that symbolism real." The office fell silent, except for the distant murmur of crowds outside. Captain Blackwood studied Thomas for a long moment, then turned to Lieutenant Foster. "The security footage from our cameras—" "Crystal clear, ma'am. Shows the entire incident, including the bikers' threatening behavior before Guard Bradley intervened and—" Foster checked his notes. "We have statements from 23 witnesses, including palace staff, all corroborating the sequence of events." Another knock at the door. This time it was Claire Bennett, the senior tour guide. "Excuse me, Captain, but Mr. Harrison is insisting on speaking with you. He's quite adamant." Captain Blackwood sighed, though Thomas detected a hint of resignation in her expression. "Send him in. It seems everyone has something to say about this incident." Edward Harrison entered, leaning on his cane but radiating the same quiet authority he'd shown in the courtyard. He nodded respectfully to Captain Blackwood, but remained standing, refusing the offered chair. "Captain," he began, his voice clear and strong, "I understand you have protocols to maintain, but I served the Crown for 40 years, earned every medal those thugs tried to take. Guard Bradley didn't just protect an old man today, he protected what these medals represent: honor, sacrifice, duty." Captain Blackwood listened, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. Edward continued, "In my time, I learned that sometimes the bravest thing isn't following orders. It's knowing when to trust your conscience." The weight of tradition seemed to press down from the portraits on the walls, generations of guards who had maintained their posts through war and peace. Yet those same guards had sworn an oath not just to stand, but to serve and protect. Finally, Captain Blackwood spoke. "Guard Bradley, your actions will require an official review. Protocol demands no less." She paused, her next words measured. "However, given the circumstances and the broader implications, you will remain on active duty during the investigation." Later that evening, as the sun began to set over Westminster Palace, Thomas Bradley found Edward Harrison sitting on a bench in the palace's private garden. The elderly veteran had been asked to remain available for any additional questions, and the palace staff had offered him this quiet space to rest. The garden's ancient walls provided a peaceful refuge from the media circus that had developed outside. "Mind if I join you, sir?" Thomas asked, now in his standard uniform rather than his ceremonial guard attire. He'd been relieved of his post for the day pending the ongoing review. Edward gestured to the empty space beside him. "Please," and dropped the "sir. "After what happened today, I think we can speak as equals." His medals caught the evening light as he shifted, making room on the bench. Thomas sat down, maintaining his military bearing even in this more casual setting. "I wanted to thank you for speaking to Captain Blackwood. You didn't have to do that." "Of course I did," Edward replied, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "You stood up for me. Least I could do was return the favor." He paused, studying a rose bush swaying gently in the evening breeze. "Reminds me of another garden long ago, in Korea." Thomas turned slightly, his interest piqued. Edward continued. "We'd been pushed back to a monastery. Beautiful place, peaceful, until it wasn't. Had to make a choice there too, between following orders and doing what was right." "What happened?" Thomas asked quietly. "Orders were to fall back, abandon the monastery. But there were civilians inside, families who'd taken shelter." Edward's fingers traced the edge of his Distinguished Service Order medal. "Sometimes the right thing isn't in any rule book." A palace gardener worked quietly in the background, pruning late-blooming flowers as the two men talked. The sweet scent of roses mixed with the earthy smell of fresh-cut grass, creating an atmosphere that encouraged confidence. "The Royal Fusiliers," Edward said suddenly. "You served with them before joining the Guard?" Thomas nodded. "2 tours in Afghanistan. How did you know?" "The way you handled yourself today. Precision in movement, economy of force, that's Fusilier training. Plus," Edward's eyes twinkled, "I was their commanding officer for 15 years. You learned to spot your own." Understanding dawned on Thomas's face. "The 2nd Battalion? During the Cold War?" "The very same." Edward straightened slightly with pride. "Led them through some interesting times, but none quite as public as your adventure today." He nodded toward the palace gates, where reporters could still be seen gathering. "Social media wasn't around in my day. Everything we did stayed in official reports." Thomas grimaced. "I didn't think about cameras when I moved. Just ... Acted on instinct," Edward finished. "Best kind of courage there is." He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Those men today, the bikers, they're part of something bigger, aren't they?" "Detective Collins thinks so," Thomas confirmed. "They've been targeting veterans, stealing medals, vandalizing memorials. Today might help the police build a stronger case." Edward nodded slowly. "Noticed them following me earlier this week. Thought I was just being paranoid." He tapped his cane thoughtfully against the garden path. "Age makes you doubt yourself sometimes, even when your instincts are right." "Your instincts seemed sharp enough today," Thomas observed. "The way you stood your ground, talked to them, that wasn't just bravery, that was experience." "When you faced real evil," Edward replied. "Thugs like that don't seem so frightening." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew an old creased photograph. "Here's something you might appreciate." The photo showed a much younger Edward, standing with his unit before a bombed-out building. Despite the destruction around them, the soldiers stood tall, their bearing proud. Thomas recognized the location immediately. "The Berlin Wall," he said softly. 2 days after it started coming down, Edward confirmed. "Moment of real change. Reminded me that sometimes breaking the rules, or walls, serves a higher purpose." He carefully returned the photo to his pocket. Much like what you did today. A palace aide approached respectfully. Mr. Harrison, your grandson's here to drive you home. She paused, adding, and Guard Bradley, Captain Blackwood would like to see you again before you leave. Edward stood slowly, leaning on his cane. Probably want to discuss your punishment for doing the right thing, he said with a knowing smile. Don't worry too much. Sometimes the system needs a good shake-up to remember its true purpose. Thomas rose as well, standing at respectful attention. Edward faced him, his expression serious. One more thing, son. Those bikers, they'll be angry about what happened today. Might try to salvage their pride somehow. Keep your eyes open. You think they'll come back? Men like that can't stand being humiliated. Just ... Edward glanced at his medals. Be careful, and thank you truly for what you did today. They shook hands, soldier to soldier, the age difference between them seeming to fade in the shared understanding of service and duty. As Edward turned to leave, Thomas noticed how the evening light caught his medals one last time, each one telling a story of courage, sacrifice, and choices made in moments that mattered. The next morning brought fresh challenges. Thomas Bradley arrived at Westminster Palace before dawn, his usual routine unchanged despite the previous day's events. But the atmosphere had shifted noticeably. News vans lined the streets outside, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like metal flowers seeking the sun. You're all over the morning papers, William Morrison informed him during the pre-shift briefing. He slid a copy of The Times across the table. The headline read, Royal Guard breaks protocol to defend war hero. Below it, a crystal-clear photo showed Thomas standing between Edward and the bikers, his ceremonial uniform striking against the palace backdrop. Lieutenant Foster entered the briefing room, his expression tense. We've got a situation developing. Those bikers you confronted? They've been busy overnight. He activated a wall screen showing security footage from various locations around London. 3 war memorials vandalized. 2 museum display cases broken into. Veterans' medals stolen. Thomas felt his jaw tighten as he watched the footage. The gang's response to yesterday's humiliation was swift and vicious. They'd left their mark at each site, a crude version of their skull and barbed wire symbol spray-painted near the damage. That's not all, Foster continued, switching to a social media feed. They're making threats online, specifically about Mr. Harrison and his medals. He paused the screen on a particularly menacing post. Old man's luck won't last forever. Neither will his toy soldier guardian. Claire Bennett, who'd been asked to join the briefing due to her knowledge of local veteran visitors, spoke up. Mr. Harrison isn't the only one they're targeting. 2 other regular visitors, both elderly veterans, reported being followed yesterday evening. Captain Blackwood entered the room, her presence immediately commanding attention. The police are taking this seriously, but their resources are stretched thin, and now we have another complication. She nodded to Foster, who pulled up a new screen. Press inquiries, he explained. Dozens of them. They're not just interested in yesterday's incident anymore. They're digging into past occasions where guards may have broken protocol, looking for patterns, controversies. Thomas maintained his professional composure, but internally he processed the ripple effects of his actions. What had begun as a single moment of conscience was expanding into something far more complex. There's more, Captain Blackwood added. Palace administration is concerned about copycat incidents. If every tourist with a problem starts expecting guards to intervene. She let the implication hang in the air. A junior guard raised his hand. Ma'am, what about Mr. Harrison? If these thugs are making threats, already addressed, Foster interjected. Local police have increased patrols near his residence, but we can't provide official protection. He's a civilian, technically outside our jurisdiction. Thomas cleared his throat. Permission to speak freely, ma'am. Captain Blackwood nodded, though her expression suggested she knew what was coming. These aren't random incidents, Thomas began. The gang is escalating specifically because of what happened here. That makes it our concern. He gestured to the footage of vandalized memorials. They're attacking symbols of military service, the very things we're meant to protect. Guard Bradley. Blackwood's voice carried a warning tone. You're already under review for breaking protocol once. With respect, ma'am, Claire interrupted. He's right. These memorials, these medals, they're not just metal and stone. They represent everything this palace stands for. If we let thugs desecrate them. The room fell silent as Blackwood considered this. Finally, she spoke. Lieutenant Foster, coordinate with local police. I want full information sharing about any incidents involving veterans or war memorials. She turned to Thomas. Guard Bradley, you'll maintain your regular duties during the review, but no more unauthorized interventions. Is that clear? Yes, ma'am, Thomas responded, though his mind was already working through alternatives. Edward's warning about the bikers seeking revenge echoed in his thoughts. As the briefing ended, William caught up with Thomas in the corridor. Heard something you should know, he said quietly. Edward Harrison's grandson works at the Imperial War Museum. One of the places hit last night. Thomas stopped walking. Targeted? Looks that way. They broke into a specific display case, one featuring medals from Korean War veterans. William glanced around before continuing. But here's the thing. They left Harrison's medals alone. Almost like they're saving them for something else, Thomas finished grimly. A young palace aide hurried up to them, slightly out of breath. Guard Bradley? Call for you from Detective Collins. She says it's urgent. In the security office, Thomas picked up the phone. Collins's voice was tense. We found something at one of the vandalized memorials. A message, scratched into the stone. Next time, no guard can save you. And below it, she paused. An address. Edward Harrison's address. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. Protocol dictated he report this through proper channels, wait for official response. But Edward's words from the garden came back to him. Sometimes the right thing isn't in any rule book. The weight of his decision pressed down like a physical force. Follow protocol and potentially leave a vulnerable veteran at risk, or act on his instincts again, knowing it could cost him everything he'd worked for. Outside the palace windows, dark clouds gathered, promising rain. Somewhere in London, a gang of angry men was planning revenge, and time was running out for Thomas Bradley to decide where his true duty lay. The threat against Edward Harrison changed everything. Thomas Bradley spent his morning shift at his post, maintaining his stoic appearance while his mind raced through possibilities. Tourists still stopped to take photos with him, many whispering about the guard who helped the veteran. But their excited chatter felt distant compared to the weight of his current dilemma. Just before noon, the situation escalated dramatically. The bikers returned to Westminster Palace, not to attack, but to put on a show. 8 motorcycles roared up to the main gates, their engines deliberately thunderous. The leader, sporting fresh bandages from yesterday's encounter, dismounted and faced the gathering crowd. Hey, everyone, he shouted, playing to the tourists' cameras. Want to hear a story about your brave palace guard? His voice dripped with mockery. Did you know these protectors are just fancy mannequins? They let old men get robbed right under their noses. Thomas maintained his position, though every muscle tensed. William Morrison at the opposite post caught his eye briefly. They both recognized this for what it was, a deliberate provocation. Captain Blackwood emerged from the palace, flanked by security personnel. This is restricted area, she announced firmly. Leave immediately or face arrest. The biker leader grinned, revealing a chipped tooth. Public street, isn't it? Just sharing some opinions. He turned back to the crowd. Did they tell you about all the other veterans getting attacked? All the medals being stolen? Where are your brave guards then? Phones recorded everything, live streaming the confrontation across social media. News vans still camped nearby from yesterday swung their cameras toward the developing scene. The bikers had chosen their moment perfectly. Maximum exposure during the busy tourist hours. Detective Inspector Collins arrived with several officers but stayed back, observing. She caught Thomas's eye and gave a subtle nod. They were gathering evidence, building a stronger case with every word the gang spoke. Claire Bennett had been leading a tour group when the bikers arrived. She quickly ushered her tourists to safety, then stepped forward. Everyone here knows what you're doing, she called out. Yesterday you tried to rob a 94-year-old war hero. Today you're back because you're embarrassed about failing. The crowd murmured in agreement. Several tourists who'd witnessed yesterday's events began sharing photos and videos with newcomers, the story spreading through the gathered masses like wildfire. The biker leader's face darkened. That old man's medals? He spat on the ground. Won't be his for long. Nobody can watch him forever. The threat was clear, and several people in the crowd gasped. Thomas felt his grip tighten on his ceremonial rifle. The gang's strategy became clear. They were trying to goad him into breaking protocol again, this time in front of an even larger audience. A second incident would surely end his career. But then a new voice cut through the tension. Actually, someone can watch him forever. Edward Harrison himself emerged from a cab that had just pulled up. His grandson, Michael, helped him stand steady as he faced the bikers. The medals on his chest caught the midday sun, each one a testament to courage under fire. You men want my medals? Edward's voice carried across the now hushed courtyard. Then face me properly. No sneaking around memorials at night, no spray painting threats on walls. His eyes locked onto the gang leader. Or are you only brave when you're vandalizing stone and glass? The crowd parted to let Edward through, many offering supportive nods or gentle pats on his shoulder. He made his way to stand near Thomas's post, his bearing proud, despite his advanced age. Your generation, Edward continued, addressing the bikers but projecting for everyone to hear, enjoys freedoms bought with the blood and sacrifice of mine. These medals? They're not about glory. They're reminders of the cost of those freedoms. Phones kept recording as Edward spoke, his words carrying the weight of lived experience. Yesterday, this guard, he nodded toward Thomas, didn't just protect an old man. He protected what these medals represent. Honor, duty, sacrifice. The biker leader shifted uncomfortably, his attempt at intimidation backfiring as Edward's words resonated with the crowd. Some tourists had tears in their eyes. Others stood straighter, recognizing the gravity of the moment. Captain Blackwood stepped forward again. You have 30 seconds to leave palace grounds or we'll have you arrested for trespassing and making threats. The gang leader glanced around, realizing his plan had gone wrong. The crowd's sympathy clearly lay with Edward and the palace guards. Any further threats would only damage their image more. This isn't over, he growled, but the words sounded hollow now. He mounted his bike, signaling his companions to do the same. As they roared away, Edward turned to Thomas, speaking quietly. They'll try something else now. Something worse. Men like that can't stand being humiliated twice. Thomas remained at attention but murmured back, We'll be ready, sir. The crowd began to disperse, but the tension lingered in the air. Everyone present understood they'd witnessed not just a confrontation, but a clash of values, honor against destruction, duty against chaos. And somewhere in London, a gang of angry men was undoubtedly planning their revenge. That evening, after his shift ended, Thomas Bradley couldn't shake his unease. The biker's public performance at the palace felt like a prelude to something worse. He changed out of his ceremonial uniform and was heading toward the staff exit when Lieutenant Foster intercepted him with urgent news. We've got a problem, Foster said, leading Thomas to the security office. The gang's been busy. He pulled up multiple surveillance feeds on the monitors. They've hit 3 more locations in the past hour. The pattern's changed, though. They're not just vandalizing anymore. The footage showed the bikers systematically photographing veteran memorials, taking pictures of names and dates. At the Imperial War Museum, where Edward's grandson worked, they'd been seen studying the building's layout, noting security camera positions. They're planning something bigger, Thomas said, watching the screens. This is reconnaissance. Detective Collins arrived, bringing more troubling news. We found this posted on their social media. She showed them a photo of Edward's medals, clearly taken during yesterday's confrontation. Below it, a message read, "True valor belongs to the strong. Time to redistribute some honors." They're going to try to take his medals, Thomas realized. Not just vandalize memorials anymore. They want to hurt him personally. It gets worse, Collins added. Our informants say they've contacted some underground collectors, people who deal in stolen military memorabilia. They're planning to sell whatever they take. William Morrison joined them, his shift also finished. I overheard Edward's grandson on the phone earlier. Someone's been following Edward's regular routes, watching his routines. They even know which days he visits his wife's grave. The implications hit Thomas hard. These weren't just angry thugs anymore. They were methodically plotting revenge, choosing the most personally painful way to strike back. Captain Blackwood entered, her face grave. I've just spoken with Palace administration. They're concerned about escalating a private matter into a security issue. We've been instructed to maintain standard protocols only. She looked at Thomas. No further interventions, Guard Bradley, that's a direct order. Thomas felt the weight of command pressing against his conscience. Ma'am, with respect, they're targeting him because of what happened here. That makes it our responsibility. The police will handle it, Blackwood replied, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Detective Collins shook her head. We're stretched thin. Budget cuts, staff shortages. We can increase patrols, but we can't provide round-the-clock protection for one citizen, even a decorated veteran. Claire Bennett, who'd been quietly listening, spoke up. It's not just about one citizen, though, is it? This is about what we stand for. If we let them hurt Mr. Harrison, steal his medals, what message does that send? Security footage continued playing on the monitors. The bikers were getting bolder, their actions more coordinated. They knew the police were watching, but didn't seem to care. Thomas's phone buzzed. A text from Edward's grandson, Michael. Granddad's being stubborn. Won't change his routines. Says he won't let them make him afraid. Typical, William muttered, reading over Thomas's shoulder. Military pride. Won't back down even when he should. Foster pulled up another screen showing police reports. Similar incidents are spreading. 3 other veterans have reported being followed. One had his home broken into, though nothing was taken. They're sending a message, no one's safe. Thomas studied the footage, his military training kicking in. They're not just angry anymore. This is tactical. They're trying to prove they can strike anywhere, anytime. He turned to Captain Blackwood. Ma'am, if we don't stop them now. I know, she interrupted, but we have to follow proper channels. The palace can't be seen taking sides in private disputes. Even when those disputes started on palace grounds? Claire challenged. Even when they're targeting the very values we're meant to protect? The room fell silent, except for the soft hum of computers. Everyone present felt the weight of the moment. Duty pulling against conscience. Protocol against protection. Thomas's phone buzzed again. Another message from Michael. Found something suspicious near Granddad's house. Looks like they've been watching him. What should I do? Before Thomas could respond, Lieutenant Foster received an alert. Breaking news. Another memorial vandalized. But this time, he paused, reading the details. This time they left Edward's service number scratched into the stone. They're making it personal. Captain Blackwood studied the various screens, her expression torn between duty and understanding. Guard Bradley, I know what you're thinking. But if you break protocol again... I know the consequences, ma'am, Thomas replied quietly. But sometimes there are worse things than losing a position. The evening sun cast long shadows through the office windows. Somewhere in London, a gang of determined men was preparing to strike at a 94-year-old veteran to steal the symbols of his sacrifice. And Thomas Bradley had to decide, follow orders and stand aside, or risk everything to protect what those medals truly meant. The crisis broke just before midnight. Thomas had been monitoring police channels from his car, parked discreetly near Edward's residence, when Michael's frantic call came through. They're here, at the Imperial War Museum. Granddad got a call saying his medals were being moved to a new display. He insisted on coming. I tried to stop him. Thomas's engine was running before Michael finished speaking. He'd anticipated something like this. The gang using Edward's medals as bait. Detective Collins had stationed plainclothes officers near the museum, but Thomas knew they wouldn't be enough. Keep him outside, Thomas ordered, already speeding through London's nearly empty streets. Don't let him enter the building. Too late, Michael's voice shook. He went in through the staff entrance. I'm going after him. Thomas pressed the accelerator harder, his military training taking over. He'd memorized the museum's layout from security footage, knowing this confrontation was inevitable. His phone buzzed with messages from William and Claire. They'd picked up the police chatter and were converging on the location. The museum loomed ahead, its massive structure dark except for security lighting. Thomas spotted Edward's grandson pacing near a side entrance, clearly torn between following his grandfather and waiting for help. "How many?" Thomas demanded as he approached. "At least 6 bikes out back," Michael reported. "They disabled the security cameras, used my employee access code somehow. Must have gotten it when they were scouting earlier." Thomas assessed the situation rapidly. "Call Detective Collins, tell her we need backup, but they have to come in quiet, no sirens." He checked his phone. "William and Claire are 3 minutes out, we wait for them." "Granddad's in there now," Michael protested. "Which is why we do this right," Thomas countered. "We're not just saving Edward, we're ending this tonight." Those 3 minutes felt eternal. When William and Claire arrived, Thomas quickly outlined his plan. Years of military and guard training had prepared him for moments like this, coordinated response to protect the vulnerable. They entered through different access points, communicating via phones on silent mode. The museum's galleries were maze-like in the dark, filled with shadows and echoes. Display cases holding centuries of military history surrounded them, silent witnesses to this modern conflict. The first sign of trouble came from the World War II exhibit, a crash of breaking glass followed by cruel laughter. Then Edward's voice, clear and defiant. "Those aren't yours to take." Thomas rounded the corner to find the gang surrounding Edward in the Korean War display area. The biker leader held a curved knife, using it to pry open a display case. His companions had formed a loose circle, some already carrying stolen medals and memorabilia. "Well, look who came to die for his medals," the leader sneered, seeing Edward. "No palace guard to save you this time, old man." "He doesn't need saving." Thomas's voice cut through the darkness. He emerged from behind a Sherman tank display, William appearing from another direction. Claire and Michael blocked the other exits. The gang leader's face contorted with rage. "You just can't help yourself, can you? Had to play hero again." He pressed the knife against the display case containing Edward's medals. "One move and these get shredded." "Those medals survived war," Edward said quietly, his bearing straight despite his age. "They survived battlefields you can't imagine. You think your little knife scares them or me?" Thomas moved forward slowly, calculating angles and distances. "It's over. Police are already surrounding the building, but how this ends is up to you." "Nothing's over." The leader's voice rose hysterically. "You humiliated us, made us look weak. Now everyone's going to see what happens when you cross us." He swung the knife toward Edward. Thomas moved with the fluid precision of his military training. The knife slashed air as he deflected the leader's arm, using the man's momentum against him. William engaged 2 other gang members while Claire and Michael protected the exits. The fight was brief, but intense. These weren't street thugs anymore. They were cornered men facing serious charges, fighting with desperate ferocity. But they faced opponents driven by something stronger than desperation. Thomas subdued the leader with a precise joint lock, forcing him to drop the knife. William, his guard training evident, efficiently neutralized his opponents. The remaining gang members, seeing their leader pinned, began to surrender. Edward stood among the chaos, straight-backed and calm. His medals gleamed in the security lighting, untouched. When Detective Collins and her team burst in moments later, they found the situation already under control. "You disobeyed orders again," Collins said to Thomas, though her tone held a note of approval. "No, Detective," Edward interrupted. "He followed the highest order any soldier can receive, the call of duty itself." The gang members were led away in handcuffs, their attempt at revenge ending not with the triumph they'd planned, but with the humiliation they'd hoped to inflict on others. As evidence teams began processing the scene, Edward approached Thomas. "Thank you, son. Not just for tonight, but for reminding an old soldier that his medals still stand for something." Thomas straightened to attention, offering a crisp salute. "They always will, sir. as long as there are people willing to stand up for what they represent. Dawn broke over London as the last police vehicles pulled away from the Imperial War Museum. The night's events had set in motion a chain of revelations that would reach far beyond a simple attempted theft. Detective Collins's team had discovered phones and documents linking the gang to a larger network of military memorabilia thieves operating across Europe. "You've helped us crack open something much bigger," Collins told Thomas as forensics teams finished processing the scene. "These men were just the visible part. Behind them, we found evidence of collectors paying thousands for stolen medals, funding these operations." Edward sat on a museum bench, looking remarkably composed for someone who'd just faced down armed criminals. His grandson Michael hovered nearby, alternating between concern and pride. "I knew they'd take the bait," Edward said, his eyes twinkling with surprising mischief. "Bait?" Thomas asked, suddenly understanding. "You knew it was a trap when you came here?" "Of course," Edward nodded. "Did you think I'd survived 3 wars by being reckless? When they called about moving my medals, I knew, but I also knew they needed to be stopped, not just for me, but for all the veterans they've targeted." William Morrison, who had stayed to help secure the scene, joined them. "The gang's leader is talking, trying to make a deal. He's named contacts in 4 countries, collectors who specifically target military honors." Claire Bennett arrived with coffee for everyone, her tour guide knowledge proving unexpectedly valuable to the investigators. "The curator says nothing irreplaceable was damaged. They're already talking about creating a new exhibit, about protecting military heritage and honor in the modern age." Thomas's phone buzzed. A message from Captain Blackwood. "Report to my office at 0900. Bring Harrison if he's willing." The captain's tone was unreadable, leaving Thomas uncertain whether to expect commendation or condemnation. As if reading his thoughts, Edward spoke up. "Sometimes, son, the best way to honor tradition is to know when to break with it. You proved that twice now." The museum's first visitors of the day were being turned away as police completed their work. News crews had begun gathering outside, alerted by social media buzz about overnight activity at the famous location. The story was already spreading. Royal Guard foils international medal theft ring. Detective Collins returned with updates. "We've recovered medals stolen from 3 other veterans. The gang was photographing and cataloging them for private collectors." She showed them images from recovered phones. They'd been building this operation for months before targeting Mr. Harrison. "Why me specifically?" Edward asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. "Your medals," Collins explained. "The Distinguished Service Order, your other decorations. They're particularly valuable to collectors. But more than that, they wanted to make a statement. Stealing from a veteran who'd stood up to them, right under the nose of the Royal Guard who'd defended him. They wanted to prove they were untouchable," Thomas finished. Instead, they proved the opposite. William, who'd been checking his phone, looked up. "It's trending again. People are sharing stories about their own veteran relatives, posting photos of medals, talking about what military service means to them. This is becoming something bigger." Claire nodded. "My morning tour is already fully booked. Everyone wants to see where it happened, learn about the medal's history. Some schools are calling about special visits to teach students about military heritage." Edward stood slowly, his movements deliberate but dignified. "Then something good has come from all this. These medals." He touched his chest where his own decorations rested. "They're not just about the past. They're promises to the future, that some things are worth protecting." The museum curator approached, looking somewhat frazzled but determined. "Mr. Harrison, would you consider helping us design that new exhibit? We'd like to tell this story, help people understand what these honors truly mean." Before Edward could respond, Thomas's phone buzzed again. Captain Blackwood had sent another message. "The palace is receiving calls from veterans organizations across the country. They're calling last night's actions restoration of honor. Perhaps there's something to be said for following the spirit of protocol rather than just its letter." Morning sunlight streamed through the museum's high windows, catching on display cases and illuminating centuries of military history. Somewhere in those halls, Thomas thought, Future visitors would learn not just about past battles, but about how the values those conflicts defended lived on in everyday choices. Edward's voice drew him back to the present. You know, when I earned these medals, it wasn't by following a manual. It was by knowing what needed to be done and finding the courage to do it. He looked at Thomas with knowing eyes. Rather like someone else I know. Detective Collins began gathering her team to leave, but paused. The gang leader said something interesting during questioning. He said they'd never understood why people made such a fuss about bits of metal and ribbon. But last night, watching you all risk everything to protect what those medals stand for, he said he finally got it. Thomas straightened his uniform, preparing to head back to the palace and face whatever consequences awaited. But as he looked at Edward, at the team that had come together to stop this threat, he knew that some duties transcended regulations. Some honors were worth any price to protect. 1 week later, Westminster Palace's grand ceremonial hall buzzed with anticipation. The morning sun streamed through centuries-old stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the assembled crowd. Police officers, palace guards, veterans, and dignitaries sat in ordered rows, while press photographers gathered discreetly at the back. Captain Victoria Blackwood stood at the podium, her uniform immaculate, her bearing commanding respect. We gather today not just to honor specific actions, but to recognize the enduring spirit of service that connects generations of those who protect and defend. Thomas Bradley sat in the front row, his ceremonial uniform perfectly pressed. Beside him, Edward Harrison sat straight-backed, his medals gleaming under the hall's crystal chandeliers. The events of the past week had transformed what began as a moment of conscience into something far more significant. The investigation sparked by recent events, Blackwood continued, has led to the recovery of over 200 stolen military medals across Europe. 43 veteran families will have their heritage returned. An international ring of military memorabilia thieves has been dismantled. Detective Collins, seated nearby, allowed herself a small smile. Her team had worked tirelessly, following leads unveiled by the museum confrontation. The gang's phones and documents had provided evidence that cracked cases spanning 3 countries. But beyond these tangible results, Blackwood said, we've witnessed something equally valuable. A reminder that duty sometimes calls us to look beyond rigid protocols to honor our deepest principles. The palace had spent days deliberating how to handle Thomas's actions. Breaking formation was a serious matter, but the public response had been overwhelming. Veterans organizations had rallied in support, sharing stories of how military honors represented not just past achievements, but ongoing responsibilities to protect and serve. Guard Thomas Bradley, Blackwood called. Please step forward. Thomas rose and approached the podium with measured steps. The hall fell silent except for the subtle click of camera shutters. Your actions, while unconventional, exemplified the highest traditions of service. You faced a choice between following protocol and following conscience. In choosing to protect a veteran and the symbols of his sacrifice, you reminded us why these protocols exist in the first place. From a polished wooden box, Blackwood withdrew a medallion on a deep blue ribbon. The Palace Guard presents you with the Commander's Commendation for Distinguished Service. Your actions have brought honor to the Guard and inspiration to others. As she placed the medallion around Thomas's neck, Edward Harrison stood, prompting everyone in the hall to rise with him. The spontaneous show of respect brought a rare gleam to Thomas's otherwise composed expression. Mr. Edward Harrison, Blackwood continued, please join us. Edward walked forward steadily, his grandson Michael beaming proudly from the audience. Claire Bennett, William Morrison, and other familiar faces from recent events watched with evident emotion. Your courage did not end with your military service, Blackwood addressed Edward. In standing firm against those who would dishonor military heritage, you demonstrated that valor knows no age. The Palace Guard recognizes you as an honorary guardian of tradition. She presented Edward with a ceremonial guards medallion, modified to reflect his unique status. The elderly veteran accepted it with dignity, but those close enough could see the moisture in his eyes. Furthermore, Blackwood announced, The Imperial War Museum has created a new permanent exhibition, Guardians of Honor, Protecting Military Heritage. It will tell the story of these events and educate future generations about the ongoing importance of preserving and protecting our military traditions. The museum's curator stood to acknowledge the announcement, nodding to Edward and Thomas. The exhibition would feature not just medals and memorabilia, but the stories of those who defended their meaning. Let these honors remind us, Blackwood concluded, that true service is not about blindly following rules, but about understanding and protecting the values those rules were created to uphold. As the ceremony concluded, visitors and officials mingled in the hall. Detective Collins approached Thomas and Edward with news. The gang's leader made a full confession, she reported. But more importantly, he's asked to meet with veteran groups to understand the real meaning behind the medals he tried to steal. Edward nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes the greatest victory is changing how others think, not just defeating them. Claire Bennett joined them, her tour guide's knowledge having proved invaluable during the investigation. The palace has approved a new addition to our official tours, a section about the living tradition of service and protection. Your story will help visitors understand that these aren't just ceremonial posts. Thomas touched the new medallion at his throat. Protocol exists for a reason, he said quietly. But so do medals. They both remind us of duties beyond the obvious. The sun had risen higher, casting the hall in brilliant light. Photographers captured the moment as Thomas and Edward stood together, the young guard and the elderly veteran, different generations united by the same understanding of duty, honor, and the courage to stand up for what's right. Captain Blackwood watched from nearby, a subtle smile softening her usually stern expression. Sometimes, she reflected, the greatest traditions were not those cast in stone, but those reborn through actions that reminded everyone why they existed in the first place. 6 months later, Thomas Bradley stood at his usual post outside Westminster Palace, the morning sun glinting off his ceremonial uniform. Spring had returned to London, bringing with it new tours, fresh faces, and constant reminders of how much had changed since that autumn day, when he first noticed an elderly veteran being harassed by bikers. The commander's commendation medal now adorned his uniform alongside his other decorations. Though Thomas wore it with characteristic humility, tourists still sometimes recognized him, the guard who protected the veteran. But these days, he was more focused on the lasting changes that had emerged from those events. Edward Harrison approached the palace gates, walking steadily with his cane. At 94.5, he remained a regular visitor, but now he came with purpose beyond personal ritual. Every Wednesday, he helped lead special tours for veteran groups and school children, sharing not just his war stories, but the more recent tale of how honor and duty could bridge generations. "Morning, son," Edward greeted Thomas, who maintained his stance but offered a subtle nod of acknowledgement, a small break from protocol that had become quietly accepted. The palace had learned that some traditions could bend without breaking. Today was special. The Imperial War Museum's new exhibition, Guardians of Honor, was officially opening its doors. Edward would be speaking at the ceremony, and Thomas had been granted permission to attend while off duty. But first, they had their regular morning ritual to maintain. Claire Bennett approached with her tour group, having incorporated the story into her regular palace presentations. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "you're looking at living history." These two men reminded our entire nation that courage and duty aren't relics of the past. The tourist group included several veterans from different countries, drawn by the story they'd heard. One American ex-soldier stepped forward, showing Edward his own medals. "Sir, what you and this guard did, it inspired us across the pond. We've started a program protecting veterans' memorabilia, teaching kids about what these medals really mean." Similar initiatives had sprung up across Europe. Detective Collins, who still kept in touch, had reported that medal theft rates had dropped significantly. The underground market for stolen military honors had been disrupted, not just by arrests, but by changing attitudes. William Morrison, now promoted to senior guard trainer, had developed new protocols incorporating lessons from the incident. "We teach them to honor tradition," he'd explained, "but also to understand why those traditions exist. Sometimes protecting what they represent means knowing when to act." As Edward chatted with the tourists, Thomas noticed a group of young bikers approaching the palace gates. For a moment, his training kicked in, muscles tensing. But these weren't troublemakers. They were part of a reformed gang outreach program, one of several positive developments that had emerged from the crisis. The bikers respectfully approached Edward, their leather jackets now bearing patches of veteran support organizations. The gang leader's confession and subsequent transformation had inspired others to change their ways, to channel their desire for meaning into protecting rather than destroying heritage. Michael, Edward's grandson, had been instrumental in developing the museum's new exhibition. He emerged from the palace gates, where he'd been finalizing details for today's ceremony. "Ready, Granddad?" "They're waiting for us." Edward straightened his medals, not just the original ones that had sparked the conflict, but also his new honorary guardian medallion. "Almost," he said, turning to Thomas. "Just saying good morning to my friend here." The morning sun caught their medals together, Thomas's commendation and Edward's decorations gleaming side by side. Though they came from different eras, their shared understanding of duty created a bridge across time. Tourist children sometimes asked their parents why the guard stood so still, why they maintained such rigid discipline. Now, thanks to the events of the past months, guides could explain that standing guard wasn't about being motionless. It was about being ready to protect what mattered most. The palace itself seemed different somehow. The ancient stones still stood proud, but they now told a new story alongside the old ones. A story about how traditions stayed alive not through blind adherence to rules, but through the courage of those who understood their deeper meaning. As Edward prepared to leave for the museum ceremony, he paused one last time. "You know, son," he said quietly to Thomas, "when I was young earning these medals, I never thought I'd have to defend them in my 90s. But I'm glad I did. Showed me they still stand for something." Thomas maintained his watch, but his voice carried quiet pride. "They always will, sir, as long as there are people willing to stand up for what they represent." The morning crowd continued to flow around them. Tourists, school children, veterans, and ordinary citizens. Each passing face represented someone who might one day need to choose between easy compliance and difficult courage. Thanks to what had happened here, they had a story to help guide them. Edward's final words that morning echoed the truth they'd both learned. "Protocols guide us, son, but principles define us. You proved that some traditions are best honored not by standing still, but by stepping forward when duty calls." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.